All right, today we're diving into a revolution. And no, I'm not talking about one with, barricades and muskets. This was a revolution of words. And it was led by this young, really passionate poet, William Wordsworth. He basically looked at poetry, the art form he loved, and just said, you know what, this is broken.
So let me just ask you, what is poetry? I mean, really, is it just a bunch of fancy words for fancy people? Something you feel like you need a special dictionary just to get through? All that complex language about gods and kings? Well, believe it or not, over 200 years ago, that was a huge problem, and Wordsworth was the guy who was dead set on fixing it.
You see, before Wordsworth came along and just shook everything up, poetry was, well, it was kind of trapped in what you might call a gilded cage. Yeah, it was beautiful to look at, sure, but it wasn't free. So back in the 18th century, the big style was called neoclassical. And what that means is that it was super formal, very intellectual, and it used this really elevated kind of artificial language. This was poetry for like the rich people in their fancy drawing rooms. It had absolutely nothing to do with the real lives or the actual language of everyday folks. And this right here shows you the problem perfectly. Okay, on the left, you've got the old style. The radiant orb ascends the celestial sphere. I mean, it sounds kind of grand, I guess, but seriously, who talks like that? Now look at the right, Wordsworth's vision. The sun rises. That's it. Simple, direct, real. This was the battle he was fighting.
So how do you break poetry out of that cage? Well, Wordsworth's solution, it started with a totally radical new definition of what a poet even is.
He just came out and said it. A poet is a man speaking to men. That's it. Not some genius on a pedestal, not a member of some secret club, just a human being talking to other human beings. I mean, with that one sentence, he basically tore down the entire wall between the poet and the public.
Now, he did think the poet was a little different, just not in the way people thought. For Wordsworth, what made you a poet wasn't your education or your social status. Nope, it was your capacity to feel. He said they had a more lively sensibility, a more comprehensive soul. They were just, they were more in tune with the deep-down emotions that connect all of us.
Okay, so if you have this new kind of poet, well, they're gonna need a new kind of language, right? If a poet is just a person who feels things more deeply, what kind of words should they actually be using to get those feelings across? This is where Wordsworth just completely threw out the old rulebook. He rejected that artificial poetic diction and argued for using the real language of men. He was convinced that the purest, most powerful feelings were found in simple, everyday rural life. So naturally, he chose to use simple, natural words. The whole point wasn't to sound clever, it was to be emotionally honest. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some artistic choice for him. This was a mission. It was about democracy. He wanted to snatch poetry out of the hands of the elite and give it back to everybody. He truly believed that the stories of, say, a shepherd in a field held more real truth than all those fancy poems about Greek gods.
Okay, so we've got a new kind of poet. We've got a new kind of language. But where does a poem actually come from? How is it born? This brings us to his most famous theory of all, his idea about the creative process.
It all starts right here, with a burst of raw, authentic feeling. Wordsworth was adamant, you couldn't fake good poetry. It had to start with a real, powerful emotion just bubbling up inside you, what he called a spontaneous overflow.
But wait, that's not the whole story. And this is where his theory gets really, really clever. That raw emotion, that's just the spark. The real art, the magic, happens later on when the poet thinks back on that feeling in a moment of peace and quiet. For Wordsworth, poetry is basically passion that's been filtered through reflection.
So he actually laid it out in a kind of four-stage blueprint. First, observation. You have a powerful emotional experience. Second, recollection. You think about that memory later when you're calm. Third, filtering. This is key. You strip away all the unnecessary details to get to the pure core emotion. And finally, fourth, composition. You take that purified emotion and shape it into a poem. It's this perfect mix of fire and focus.
So that's the theory, which sounds great. But how does it actually work in the real world? Let's take a look at a quick case study from one of his most famous poems to see it in action.
His poem, The Solitary Reaper, is the perfect example of all this stuff in action. First, look at the subject. It's super humble, just an ordinary farm worker, a girl working alone in a field. The language? Simple, direct. Behold her, single in the field. The whole poem comes from the speaker's powerful emotional reaction to hearing her song, even though he can't understand the words. And here's the crucial part. He carries that feeling with him. He remembers it later in tranquillity, and he turns this one fleeting moment into something timeless, something that lasts forever.
And really, that's the heart of it all, isn't it? Wordsworth's whole revolution was about telling the world, hey, you don't need to look at kings or ancient myths to find profound truth and beauty. It's right here. It's all around us. It's in a song you overhear by chance. It's in a field of daffodils. It's in the simple, powerful moments of an ordinary life.
Which kind of leaves us with a big question for our own time, doesn't it? In this age of just endless content and constant noise, what can this 200-year-old idea from Wordsworth teach us about the power of just slowing down, of paying attention, and of finding something truly meaningful in the simple moments?